I watched my own son-in-law try to poison me at Thanksgiving dinner, and what I did next changed everything. But before you judge me for what I'm about to tell you, I need you to understand how we got here. Comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Because this story of betrayal and revenge could happen in any family, anywhere in America. If stories like this grip you the way they grip me, hit that subscribe button now. Because I'm 73 years old, and I've got more secrets than most people have birthdays. This one nearly killed me. Literally. My name is Dorothy Castellano, and 18 months ago, I sold the real estate agency I'd built from nothing for $18 million. $18 million. At 73, after 4 to 7 years of grinding through a man's world, selling houses one handshake at a time, I finally had more money than I knew what to do with. My late husband Vincent would have been proud. He'd always said I had more business sense in my pinky finger than most men had in their entire bodies. The sale happened on a Tuesday in October. Meridian Properties, the corporate giant that had been circling my little agency like vultures for 3 years, finally made an offer I couldn't refuse. Not because I was greedy, but because I was tired. Bone tired. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix, that comes from carrying other people's dreams and disappointments for half a century. I remember standing in my office that Tuesday evening, looking at the framed photo of Vincent on my desk. He'd been gone 8 years, but I still caught myself reaching for the phone to call him with good news. The building was empty except for security, and I could hear my footsteps echo as I walked through the office one last time. 4 to 7 years of my life lived in these rooms. Commission checks that paid for dance lessons and college tuition. Late nights when deals fell through and dreams crumbled. Victory champagne when first-time buyers got their keys. But I wasn't sentimental about it. Vincent always said I was practical to a fault, and he was right. The money would secure my family's future, and at 73, I had maybe 10 good years left. Maybe 15 if I was lucky. I wanted to spend them watching my grandchildren grow up, not arguing with 20-something agents about marketing budgets. My daughter Jessica was the first person I called. She'd been after me for years to retire, especially after Vincent passed. Jessica had always been my responsible child. The one who balanced her checkbook and never forgot a birthday. She worked as a nurse practitioner at Children's Hospital, married to Bradley, who managed IT systems for a pharmaceutical company. They had 2 kids, Emma, who was 12 and sharp as a tack, and little Michael, who was 9 and still believed in magic. When I told Jessica about the sale, she cried. Not sad tears, but relief tears. She'd been worried about me working so hard at my age, worried about me driving to show houses at all hours, worried about me dealing with difficult clients who thought they could bully an old woman. She didn't know that I'd been dealing with difficult men since before she was born, that I could spot a time waster from 3 blocks away, that I could negotiate circles around men half my age while serving them coffee and homemade cookies. My son David was a different story. David was my wild card. The one who'd dropped out of college to become a musician, who'd finally settled down at 38 when he married Cassandra. Cassie, as she insisted everyone call her, was 15 years younger than David, with platinum blonde hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She worked in social media marketing, which seemed to mean she spent most of her time taking pictures of food and posting them online. When I told David about the sale, his first question wasn't about my retirement or my happiness. It was about inheritance taxes and trust funds and whether I'd talked to an estate attorney. I should have seen the red flag right then, but I was high on freedom and the smell of success. I brushed off his concerns, told him we'd figure out the financial details later. But Cassie got very interested very quickly. Suddenly, she was calling me twice a week, asking about my health, suggesting we spend more time together. She started showing up at my house with little gifts, expensive hand cream, gourmet tea, silk scarves that cost more than most people spent on groceries. When I asked where she got the money for such extravagant gifts, she'd laugh and say David was doing well with his music. Which was strange, because David's band played wedding receptions and birthday parties. Nice work, steady work, but not silk scarf money. The first hint that something was wrong came 3 weeks after the sale, when I got a call from my bank. There had been an attempt to access my account online, using a password that was close but not quite right. The security department flagged it because the attempts came from an IP address that didn't match my usual location. When I asked where the attempts came from, they gave me an address I didn't recognize. But when I looked it up, it was 2 blocks from where David and Cassie lived. I didn't say anything to anyone. Not yet. But I started paying attention in ways I hadn't before. I started noticing things. Like how Cassie always had her phone out when she visited, even when we were talking. How she asked casual questions about my daily routine, my doctor appointments, which pharmacy I used. How she complimented my jewelry and asked about the insurance values, laughing it off as professional curiosity since she handled social media for an insurance agency. Except I'd never heard her mention working for an insurance agency before. Or how David started asking about my will more frequently. He'd bring it up casually, usually after a glass or two of wine, wondering if I'd updated it recently, if I'd considered setting up trusts for the grandchildren, if I'd thought about what would happen if I got sick. When I reminded him that I was in perfect health, better health than most people my age, he'd smile and say he was just being practical, just looking out for me. But the thing that really got my attention was Thanksgiving. Every year since Vincent died, I'd hosted Thanksgiving at my house. It was tradition. Jessica would bring the turkey, David would bring wine, and everyone would gather around the dining room table that Vincent and I had bought 43 years ago for our first house. It was the one time of year when my whole family was in one place, when the grandchildren would sit still long enough for me to really look at them and marvel at how much they'd grown. This year was going to be special. My first Thanksgiving as a millionaire, my first Thanksgiving as a retired woman. I'd invited everyone 3 weeks early, bought a new tablecloth, planned a menu that would make Vincent proud. I was going to announce that I was setting up college funds for Emma and Michael, that I was taking Jessica and Bradley on a cruise to celebrate their 15th anniversary, that I was finally ready to be the grandmother who spoiled everyone rotten. But 2 days before Thanksgiving, Cassie called with a different idea. Why didn't we have Thanksgiving at her house this year? She and David had been talking, and they thought it would be nice for me to be a guest for once, to not have to worry about cooking and cleaning. They had a bigger kitchen, a bigger dining room. It would be more comfortable for everyone. I said no, of course. Thanksgiving was at my house. It had always been at my house. Vincent and I had hosted Thanksgiving for 46 years, and I wasn't about to stop now. But Cassie persisted. She called Jessica, got her on board by playing up how hard I'd been working, how I deserved to relax. She called Emma and Michael, got them excited about a different house with a different setup. She made it sound like a gift, like they were doing me a favor. By the time Thanksgiving morning arrived, the plan had changed without my real consent. We were having dinner at David and Cass's house. I was bringing the cranberry sauce and my famous apple pie, but everything else was being handled by my daughter-in-law. The woman who'd never cooked anything more complicated than pasta salad was going to handle Thanksgiving dinner for 8 people. I should have trusted my instincts. I should have insisted on having it at my house, or at least helped with the cooking. But I was tired of being the matriarch, tired of being responsible for everyone else's happiness. And part of me, a bigger part than I wanted to admit, was curious to see what Cassie was really up to. Because by then, I knew she was up to something. The question was what, and how far she was willing to go to get it. I had no idea I was about to find out in the most terrifying way possible. Walking into David and Cass's house that Thanksgiving afternoon felt like entering a stage set. Everything was too perfect, too coordinated, too carefully planned. The dining room table was set with china I'd never seen before. Expensive china, the kind with gold trim and delicate painted flowers that whispered of old money. The centerpiece was elaborate, professional-looking, like something from a magazine spread. But what struck me most was how nervous everyone seemed. Not excited nervous, like you'd expect for a special family dinner. Anxious nervous. Jessica kept checking her phone and fidgeting with her earrings. Bradley was unusually quiet, nursing a beer and staring out the window. Even the kids seemed subdued, sitting unusually still in the living room instead of running around like they normally did. Only Cassie seemed completely at ease. She floated through the rooms in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than most people's rent, her blonde hair styled in perfect waves, her makeup flawless. She greeted me with a hug that lasted just a little too long, and when she pulled back, her eyes were studying my face like she was looking for something specific. David hugged me next, and I caught a whiff of something on his breath that wasn't alcohol. Something medicinal, chemical. When I looked at him more closely, his pupils seemed dilated, his hands slightly shaky. I'd raised this boy, changed his diapers, stayed up all night when he had croup. I knew when something was wrong with my son. But when I asked if he was feeling all right, Cassie answered for him. Oh, he was just tired from all the cooking preparation. They'd been up since 5 in the morning, getting everything ready. She linked her arm through his possessively, and David just nodded along like a marionette. The smell hit me as soon as I walked toward the kitchen. It should have smelled like turkey and stuffing, like butter and herbs and all the warm, comforting sense of Thanksgiving. Instead, it smelled like something was burning. Not food burning, something else. Something sharp and acrid that made my nose twitch. Cassie noticed me sniffing and laughed. Oh, that was just the new candles she'd bought. Some fancy brand that was supposed to smell like autumn leaves, but she thought maybe they were a little too strong. She'd blown them out, but the scent lingered. Except I didn't see any candles. And I'd been around long enough to know the difference between candle smoke and chemical residue. The turkey came out of the oven looking perfect. Too perfect. Golden brown, expertly seasoned, carved with professional precision. For a woman who usually burned toast, Cassie had suddenly developed the skills of a 5-star chef. When I complimented her on it, she blushed and said she'd been watching cooking shows, practicing for weeks. But I noticed she didn't eat much of the turkey herself. In fact, as we sat down to dinner, I noticed she wasn't eating much of anything. She pushed food around her plate, took tiny bites, spent most of the time encouraging everyone else to eat more. Try this, taste that, fill up their plates. The conversation was stilted, forced. Usually, our family dinners were chaos. Everyone talking at once, Emma and Michael fighting over who got the wishbone, Jessica telling stories from the hospital, David playing guitar after dessert. This felt like a business dinner where nobody really wanted to be there. And Cassie kept staring at me. Not obviously, but I caught her watching me eat, watching me drink, watching me react to the food. When our eyes met, she'd smile that bright, empty smile and ask if I needed more wine, more water, more of anything. It was when she brought out the soup course that everything started to click into place. We'd already had salad, already started on the turkey and sides. Soup after the main course was unusual, but Cassie presented it like it was a special tradition from her family. A butternut squash bisque that her grandmother used to make, she said. Something she'd wanted to share with David's family for years but had never felt confident enough to attempt. The soup was beautiful, served in delicate china bowls with a swirl of cream and a sprinkle of something that looked like nutmeg. It smelled rich and comforting, exactly like butternut squash soup should smell. But there was something else underneath. Something that reminded me of that sharp scent I'd noticed in the kitchen. Cassie served everyone individually, making a big show of ladling from the pot and arranging each bowl just so. She served me last, and I watched her face carefully as she set the bowl in front of me. For just a split second, her mask slipped. I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. Not love, not family affection, not even dislike. I saw calculation. That's when I started really paying attention. I watched as David raised his spoon, then suddenly seemed to remember something and put it down. I watched as Jessica took a small sip, made an appreciative sound, then got distracted by Michael spilling his water. I watched as Bradley lifted his spoon to his mouth, then got called away to help clean up the spill. And I watched as Cassie sat there, her own bowl untouched, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. If you've ever had that moment when your instincts start screaming at you, when every nerve in your body is telling you that something is terribly, dangerously wrong, then you know exactly how I felt sitting at that table. My hands were shaking as I lifted the spoon. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. But I was 73 years old, and I'd survived a lot of things that should have killed me. An abusive first marriage when I was 19. A car accident that left me in the hospital for 6 weeks. Breast cancer at 58. I'd learned to trust my instincts, even when they told me things I didn't want to believe. Especially when they told me things I didn't want to believe. I set down my spoon and looked around the table. Jessica was checking her phone again, frowning at something on the screen. Bradley was helping Michael with his napkin. Emma was texting under the table, probably to her friends. David was staring at nothing, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his wine glass. And Cassie was still watching me, waiting for me to eat the soup. That's when I knew for certain that whatever was in that bowl wasn't meant to nourish me. It was meant to hurt me. Maybe kill me. The question was, how badly did she want me dead, and what was she planning to do when I didn't cooperate? I was about to find out that Cassie had thought of everything. Everything except the fact that I hadn't survived this long by being anyone's fool. But if I played this wrong, this could be my last Thanksgiving. And I wasn't ready to give up yet. Not when I finally had everything to live for. I've replayed the next 60 seconds 1,000 times in my mind, and I still get chills thinking about how close I came to eating that soup. How close I came to never seeing another sunrise. Cassie was getting impatient. I could see it in the way her fingers drummed against the tablecloth, the way her smile was becoming more forced with each second I didn't lift that spoon to my mouth. She started making comments about how the soup was getting cold, how she'd worked so hard on the recipe, how disappointed she'd be if I didn't at least try it. Everyone else had taken a few polite sips and moved on to other things. The conversation had shifted to Emma's upcoming school play, to Michael's soccer tournament, to Jessica's plans for Christmas. Normal family talk that should have been comforting but felt surreal under the circumstances. I needed to think fast. I needed to figure out what was in that soup without raising suspicion, and I needed to do it in a way that wouldn't put anyone else at risk. Because if Cassie was willing to poison me, I had no idea how far she'd go to protect her secret. That's when I remembered something Vincent used to do at business dinners when he suspected someone was trying to get him drunk to cloud his judgment. He'd pretend to sip his drink while barely touching it to his lips, or he'd find ways to accidentally spill it, or he'd switch glasses when nobody was looking. He called it survival tactics for the corporate jungle. I never thought I'd need survival tactics at a family dinner. The opportunity came when Michael knocked over his water glass, again. He was always spilling something, that kid. Jessica jumped up to get paper towels, Bradley went to the kitchen for a dish towel, and David just sat there looking dazed while Cassie fussed over the tablecloth. In the chaos of cleaning up the spill, I did something I never thought I'd do in my life. I switched my soup bowl with Cass's mother's. Lorraine Patterson had been sitting to my right, mostly silent throughout dinner. She was Cass's mother, a woman in her early 50s who'd always seemed pleasant enough but distant. She worked as a secretary at some insurance office, lived alone in a small apartment across town, and usually only appeared at family gatherings when Cassie specifically invited her. Tonight, Lorraine seemed even more withdrawn than usual. She'd barely touched her food, barely contributed to conversation, and spent most of the evening staring at her hands. I'd assumed she was just shy or maybe feeling under the weather. Now I realized she might have been feeling guilty, because when I quietly slid my soup bowl to where hers had been sitting, and moved her bowl in front of me, she didn't notice. She was too busy dabbing at the water stain on the tablecloth, too busy avoiding eye contact with anyone at the table. But Cassie noticed. I saw the exact moment when she looked up from the spill and realized what I'd done. Her face went through a series of expressions so quickly that anyone else would have missed them. Confusion first, then understanding, then pure, undiluted panic. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, then closed it again. Her eyes darted between me and her mother, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to figure out how to fix this without exposing herself. But it was too late. Because right then, Lorraine lifted the spoon to her mouth and took a large sip of what was supposed to be my soup. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Within 30 seconds, Lorraine's face went pale. Within a minute, she was gripping the edge of the table, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Within 2 minutes, she was slumping forward, her eyes rolling back, her body starting to convulse. Cassie screamed. Not the scream of a daughter watching her mother collapse. The scream of someone whose plan had just gone horribly, catastrophically wrong. Jessica, thank God, went into nurse mode immediately. She was checking Lorraine's pulse, tilting her head back to keep her airway clear, shouting at Bradley to call 911. David just sat there in shock, his face white as paper, while Emma and Michael started crying. And me? I sat there watching my daughter-in-law fall apart, finally understanding the full scope of what she'd been planning. Because as Lorraine convulsed on the dining room floor, as paramedics rushed through the front door 8 minutes later, as my family's Thanksgiving dinner turned into a crime scene, I realized this wasn't just about money. This was about something much worse. The paramedics worked on Lorraine for 20 minutes before they could stabilize her enough to transport. I watched Cassie pace the living room, her hands shaking, her makeup smeared with tears that looked real enough but felt hollow. She kept saying it didn't make sense, that her mother had seemed fine earlier, that she couldn't understand what had happened. But I caught her looking at me twice during those 20 minutes, and in her eyes I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Not fear for her mother's life. Fear that I knew what she'd done. The lead paramedic, a young woman who reminded me of Jessica at that age, asked about allergies, medications, what Lorraine had eaten. Cassie rattled off answers like she'd rehearsed them, but when she got to the soup, her voice faltered slightly. The paramedic asked if anyone else had eaten the soup. Jessica, Bradley, and David all said they'd had a few spoonfuls. The paramedic looked at me, and I made a decision that would change everything. I lied. I told her I hadn't touched the soup yet when Lorraine collapsed. I said I'd been too busy talking to Emma about her school play. The paramedic made a note and moved on to other questions. But Cassie heard the lie, and she knew I was sending her a message. I knew what she'd done, and I was choosing not to expose her. Yet, as the ambulance pulled away with Lorraine inside, as my family stood in the driveway in shock, as neighbors came out of their houses to see what the commotion was about, I made a promise to myself. I was going to find out exactly what Cassie had put in that soup, exactly why she'd wanted me dead, and exactly how far this conspiracy went. Because I had a feeling this wasn't just about one desperate daughter-in-law and one poisoned bowl of soup. This was bigger. Much bigger. And before I was done, everyone who'd betrayed me was going to pay for it. But first, I had to make sure Lorraine survived. Because whether she knew it or not, she'd just saved my life by taking a sip of soup meant to kill me. Now I owed her the same favor. The hospital waiting room at 11 o'clock on Thanksgiving night is a special kind of hell. The fluorescent lights were too bright, the coffee was terrible, and everyone looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on earth. But I couldn't leave. Not until I knew whether Lorraine was going to make it, and not until I had some answers. Jessica had gone home to put the kids to bed, but she'd be back in the morning. Bradley had offered to drive me home twice, but I'd refused. David sat in the corner looking like he was about to throw up, and Cassie paced the hallway making phone calls to people she claimed were Lorraine's friends from work. But I was watching her carefully now, and nothing about her behavior made sense for someone whose mother was fighting for her life. She wasn't crying anymore. The tears had stopped the moment we'd left the house, like she'd flipped a switch. She kept checking her phone, but not for updates from doctors or calls from concerned relatives. She was texting someone. Multiple someones. And from where I sat, I could see her deleting the messages as soon as she sent them. At midnight, Dr. Patel came out to talk to us. Lorraine was stable but critical. They'd pumped her stomach and were running blood tests to identify what she'd ingested. It was definitely some kind of toxin, possibly plant-based, definitely dangerous. She was unconscious but her vital signs were improving. Then Dr. Patel asked the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Did we know if Lorraine had been depressed lately? Had she mentioned wanting to hurt herself? Because the preliminary blood work suggested she'd ingested a significant amount of oleander extract, enough to kill someone, but taken in a way that suggested either a suicide attempt or accidental poisoning. Cassie jumped on the suicide narrative immediately. Oh yes, her mother had been so depressed lately. Money troubles, health scares, loneliness since her divorce 2 years ago. It was entirely possible she'd done this to herself. Maybe even planned it for a family gathering to make a statement. I wanted to vomit. Watching my daughter-in-law throw her own mother under the bus to cover up attempted murder was almost more than I could handle. But I kept my mouth shut and filed away every word for later. Dr. Patel asked about the dinner, what everyone had eaten, whether there were any shared dishes that might have been contaminated. Cassie answered smoothly, mentioned the soup but said her mother had barely touched it, claimed Lorraine had been acting strange all evening. But when the doctor asked about leftovers, about whether the soup could be tested, Cassie's composure cracked for just a moment. She said she'd already thrown everything away, cleaned up the kitchen, hadn't thought to save anything. Just wanted to get the mess cleaned up while dealing with the crisis. Which was complete bullshit, because I'd been there. The kitchen had been spotless when we left for the hospital. Too spotless. Like someone had scrubbed every surface with bleach and thrown away every trace of evidence. At 2 in the morning, I told David I was going home to get some rest. I was tired, I said. Old. Needed my own bed and my own space to process what had happened. I'd be back in the morning to check on Lorraine. David offered to drive me, but I said I'd call a cab. Needed some time to think, needed some air. He was too rattled to argue, and Cassie was too busy with her phone to pay attention to my departure. But I didn't go home. Instead, I had the cab drop me off at the 24-hour diner 3 blocks from David's house, and I sat in a corner booth drinking coffee and planning my next move. Because if Cassie thought she was going to get away with this, she didn't know Dorothy Castellano very well. I'd built a real estate empire by outthinking people who underestimated me. I'd survived Vincent's death by being tougher than grief. I'd raised 2 kids as a single working mother by being smarter than the system designed to defeat me. And I was sure as hell not going to let some gold-digging wannabe murderer end my story. At 5 in the morning, when I was sure everyone would be asleep, I walked back to David's house. I still had the key he'd given me years ago for emergencies, back when I thought emergencies meant burst pipes or power outages. I never imagined I'd use it to investigate my own attempted murder. The house was dark and quiet. David's car was in the driveway, but Cass's was gone. Probably still at the hospital, keeping up appearances. I let myself in through the back door and went straight to the kitchen. Cassie had been thorough, I'll give her that. The garbage cans were empty, the dishwasher had been run twice based on the lingering smell of detergent, and every surface had been scrubbed clean. But she'd made one mistake. She'd forgotten about the garbage disposal. I'd installed enough kitchens in my 47 years of real estate to know that garbage disposals never get everything. There's always residue, always something left behind. I unscrewed the collar, pulled out the splash guard, and found what I was looking for. Oleander leaves. Small pieces, chopped fine, but definitely oleander. I knew because Vincent and I had planted oleander bushes in our first backyard 45 years ago, before we knew how poisonous they were. We'd ripped them out when Jessica was born, but I'd never forgotten the distinctive shape of the leaves. I took pictures with my phone, saved the evidence in a small plastic bag I found in the pantry, and put everything back exactly as I'd found it. Then I searched the rest of the house. In the master bedroom, I found Cass's laptop open on the dresser. She'd left it logged in, another mistake that would cost her dearly. I took pictures of her browser history, her email inbox, her text messages. What I found made my blood run cold. Cassie hadn't just been planning to kill me. She'd been planning it for months. There were Google searches for natural poisons that look like heart attacks, oleander poisoning symptoms, how to access someone else's bank account, estate planning for elderly relatives. There were emails to someone named Marcus Chen about insurance policies and timeline adjustments. There were text messages to David about my daily routine, my health appointments, my social activities. There were even messages to someone called Jay about backup plans and cleanup protocols. But the most damning thing I found was a document saved on her desktop called financialplanning.doc. When I opened it, I found a detailed breakdown of my assets, my investments, my real estate holdings, my bank accounts. She knew exactly how much money I had, where it was kept, and how to access it. At the bottom of the document was a timeline. Thanksgiving dinner was marked as tea day. The week after Thanksgiving was marked as funeral and will reading. 2 weeks after that was marked as account transfers begin. She'd planned my entire death and the disposal of my money before she'd even bought the turkey. But the most chilling part was the final note at the bottom of the document: if Dorothy survives or becomes suspicious, implement Plan B immediately. Contact J for cleanup assistance. Priority: protect D at all costs. Plan B cleanup assistance. Protect D at all costs. My son David wasn't just married to a would-be murderer. He was part of the conspiracy. And now that I knew their secret, I was in more danger than ever. But I was also angry in a way I hadn't been since Vincent died. The kind of anger that burns clean and bright and gives you strength you didn't know you had. They wanted to play games with Dorothy Castellano? Fine. But they were about to learn that I'd been playing games since before they were born, and I always won. Finding out that your own child wants you dead changes everything you thought you knew about love, family, and the people you die for. I sat in that dark kitchen, staring at evidence of my son's betrayal, and felt something inside me break that I knew would never heal properly. David wasn't just complicit. He was an active participant. The text messages between him and Cassie told the whole story. Messages going back 8 months, starting right after I'd first mentioned thinking about selling the agency. Messages about my daily routine, my doctor appointments, my medication schedule. Messages about which of my friends visited regularly, which neighbors paid attention to my comings and goings, how often Jessica checked in on me. My son had been studying me like a mark, cataloging my vulnerabilities, reporting back to his wife like I was some kind of target they were planning to rob. But the worst part was how calculated it all was. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. They'd been planning this for almost a year, waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity, the right cover story. They'd chosen Thanksgiving because it would look natural for me to have a heart attack during a stressful family gathering. They'd chosen oleander because it could be explained as an accident or suicide. They'd even researched the timing of the poison to make sure I'd collapse at home, not at the hospital where doctors might ask inconvenient questions. There were messages about backup plans, about what to do if the poison didn't work fast enough, about how to handle Jessica if she got suspicious. There were messages about the insurance policy I'd taken out 5 years ago, about the trust fund I'd set up for the grandchildren, about how to access my safe deposit box. They'd thought of everything. Except they hadn't counted on me switching the soup bowls. They hadn't counted on Lorraine taking the dose meant for me. And they definitely hadn't counted on me being smart enough to figure out what they'd done. I was still sitting in that kitchen at 6:30 in the morning when I heard David's key in the front door. I had just enough time to close the laptop and slip out the back before he came into the kitchen. I hid behind the garbage cans in the backyard and watched through the window as he made coffee, checked his phone, and then, this broke my heart, called the hospital to check on Lorraine. He sounded genuinely concerned. Genuinely upset. If I didn't know better, I would have thought he was a caring son-in-law worried about his wife's mother. But I did know better now. And I could see the performance for what it was. When Cassie came home 20 minutes later, they had a conversation that confirmed everything I'd learned from their messages. She was panicking about the evidence, worried that I'd figured out what happened, afraid that Lorraine might remember something when she woke up. David was trying to calm her down, reassure her that they'd covered their tracks, convince her that I didn't suspect anything. But then Cassie said something that made my blood freeze. What if she doesn't die, David? What if your mother figures this out? What if Lorraine wakes up and remembers seeing me near the soup? What if that nosy Jessica starts asking questions about the timing? David's response was quiet, measured, terrifying in its casualness. Then we implement Plan B. We can't risk her exposing us now. We're too close to getting everything we need. But she's your mother. And she's standing between us and $18 million. I'm not going to prison because you couldn't handle a simple poisoning. I had to bite my hand to keep from screaming. This was my baby boy, the child I'd rocked to sleep every night for the first 2 years of his life. The kid who used to crawl into bed with Vincent and me during thunderstorms. The teenager who'd cried when our dog died and made me promise we'd get another one someday. This was the man who was now discussing the best way to murder his own mother. I slipped away while they were still talking, walked to the diner, and called a cab to take me home. I needed time to think, time to process what I'd learned, and time to figure out how to stay alive long enough to make them pay for what they'd done. But mostly, I needed time to grieve. Because the David I'd raised, the David I'd loved unconditionally for 45 years, was gone. Had maybe never existed at all. And in his place was a stranger who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle between him and my money. By the time I got home, the sun was coming up and my phone was ringing. It was Jessica, calling to check on me, to see how I was holding up after the terrible night we'd had. Sweet Jessica, who had no idea how terrible it had really been. I almost told her everything right then. Almost broke down and confessed that her brother had tried to kill me, that her sister-in-law was a calculating murderer, that our family was built on lies and greed and betrayal. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the realization that if I exposed David and Cassie now, they'd just deny everything. It would be my word against theirs, and I had no proof that would hold up in court. The evidence I'd gathered was obtained illegally. Breaking into their house, photographing their private communications. Any decent lawyer would get it thrown out. Or maybe it was the knowledge that if they knew I was onto them, they'd escalate to Plan B immediately. And I still didn't know what Plan B involved, except that it would be more direct, more violent, and harder to survive. So I lied to Jessica. Told her I was fine, just tired and shaken up by what had happened to Lorraine. I promised to get some rest and call her later in the day. But rest was the last thing on my mind. I had work to do. The first thing I did was call my lawyer, Richard Brennan. Richard had handled Vincent's estate, had helped me set up my will and trust funds, had been my legal advisor for 15 years. I trusted him completely, which was more than I could say for anyone else at that moment. I told Richard the first needed to see him urgently, that I wanted to make some changes to my estate planning. When he tried to schedule something for the following week, I told him it couldn't wait. I needed to see him that morning, Thanksgiving or not. Richard agreed to meet me at his office at 10 o'clock. Bless him, he didn't ask questions, just said he'd bring the necessary files and would take care of whatever I needed. The second thing I did was call my bank. I told them I was concerned about unauthorized access attempts on my account, that I wanted to change all my passwords and add additional security measures. I also asked them to flag any unusual activity, any attempts to transfer funds or access safe deposit boxes. The third thing I did was call Marcus Chen. I'd found his number in Cass's messages, along with references to insurance policies and timeline adjustments. A quick internet search told me he was a private investigator who specialized in insurance fraud and estate planning disputes. The kind of person you'd hire if you wanted to make sure someone's death looked accidental and their money transferred smoothly. I called his office and made an appointment for that afternoon, using a fake name. If Cassie was working with a private investigator to plan my death, I wanted to know exactly what they were plotting. But the most important thing I did that morning was write everything down. Every detail of what had happened at Thanksgiving dinner, every piece of evidence I'd found, every conversation I'd overheard. I wrote it all out in longhand, signed and dated each page, and put it in my safe deposit box along with the photos from Cass's computer and the oleander evidence from the garbage disposal. If something happened to me, if David and Cassie succeeded in killing me, there would be a record of what they'd done. Jessica would know the truth, even if she learned it too late to save me. By 9:30 that morning, I was sitting in Richard's office, watching him review my current will with growing concern on his face. "Dorothy, what's this about?" he asked finally. "Yesterday you were a healthy, happy retiree with a loving family and a bright future. Today you're talking about changing your beneficiaries and adding suspicious death clauses. What happened?" I told him everything. Every horrible detail of what I'd discovered about David and Cassie, every piece of evidence I'd collected, every plan they'd made to steal my money and end my life. Richard listened without interrupting, his expression growing more grave with each revelation. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he looked up from his notes and asked the question I'd been dreading. "Dorothy, what do you want to do about this?" It was the question I'd been asking myself all morning. What did I want to do? Turn them into the police and watch my son go to prison? Confront them directly and risk them escalating to violence? Run away and hide, abandoning my family and my life? None of those options felt right. None of them gave me what I really wanted, which was justice. Not just punishment for what they'd done, but consequences that fit the crime. They tried to take everything from me. My life, my money, my legacy, my family's love and respect. I wanted to take everything from them in return. "I want to destroy them," I told Richard. "I want them to lose everything they care about, everything they've worked for, everything they thought they were going to get from killing me. I want them to understand exactly what it feels like to have someone you trust betray you in the worst possible way." Richard nodded slowly. "That's not going to be easy. And it's not going to be legal, at least not entirely." "I don't care about easy," I said. "And I'm 73 years old. I don't have time to care about entirely legal." "All right then," Richard said, pulling out a fresh legal pad. "Let's talk about how to give David and Cassie exactly what they deserve." And that's how I started planning the most elaborate, devastating revenge of my life. A revenge that would take everything from them, just like they tried to take everything from me. But first, I had to survive long enough to see it through. Because I had a feeling that once they realized Lorraine was going to recover and start talking, David and Cassie would stop playing games. And Plan B was about to become Plan A. Marcus Chen's office was in one of those generic strip malls that every American suburb, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service, with tinted windows and a sign so small you'd drive past it twice before noticing it. Exactly the kind of place where people go when they need services they don't want anyone to know about. I'd spent the morning at Richard's office working out the legal framework for my revenge, and now it was time to understand exactly what David and Cassie had been planning with their hired help. I was using the name Margaret Walsh, ironic, considering I'd always hated that name, and a story about needing to investigate a potential insurance fraud case involving my late husband's policy. Marcus Chen was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with tired eyes and the kind of rumpled appearance that suggested he'd seen too much of humanity's worst impulses. His office was cluttered with case files, empty coffee cups, and the general debris of a man who spent his days digging through other people's secrets. He listened to my fake story about insurance concerns with the practiced patience of someone who'd heard every lie people tell when they need his services. But when I mentioned that I was particularly concerned about oleander poisoning being used to fake a natural death, his entire demeanor changed. He sat up straighter, studied my face more carefully, and asked me to repeat the name I'd given him. "Margaret Walsh," I said, maintaining eye contact. "And you said your husband died of a suspected heart attack, but you think he was actually poisoned?" "That's right." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, drumming his fingers on his desk. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and gave me a look that was part admiration, part concern. Mrs. Walsh, he said slowly, I think you and I need to have a different conversation. My heart started pounding, but I kept my expression neutral. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean that either you're the most remarkably well-informed widow in the history of insurance fraud investigations, or you're Dorothy Castellano and you've figured out what your son and daughter-in-law have been planning. The jig was up, but strangely, I felt relieved rather than afraid. I was tired of pretending, tired of lying, tired of being afraid of my own family. You're good at your job, Mr. Chen. Good enough to know when I'm in over my head, he said. And lady, I have been in way over my head since the day Cassie Castellano walked into this office. For the next hour, Marcus Chen told me everything. Everything about how Cassie had hired him 6 months ago to investigate my daily routines, my financial holdings, my medical history. Everything about how she'd asked him to research methods of untraceable poisoning, ways to make murder look like natural causes, techniques for accessing bank accounts after someone's death. But here's the thing that probably saved my life. Marcus Chen had been uncomfortable with the job from the beginning. Look, Mrs. Castellano, he said, I've done a lot of questionable things in my career. Cheating spouse investigations, insurance fraud cases, background checks that weren't entirely legal. But this was different. This woman wasn't just planning fraud. She was planning murder. He'd taken her money, $5,000 up front, with another $10,000 promised after my death. But he'd also been documenting everything. Every conversation, every request, every piece of information he'd gathered. Not because he was planning to turn her in, but because he was covering his own ass in case things went wrong. I've been doing this work for 12 years, he said. And I've learned that people who are willing to kill family members for money don't stop at one murder. Eventually, she would have decided I knew too much, and I'd become a liability she needed to eliminate. So Marcus had been playing both sides. Taking Cass's money and providing her with the information she wanted, but also building a case file that would protect him if everything went south. He had recordings of their conversations, copies of the research he'd done, documentation of every payment she'd made. It was exactly what I needed to destroy them. But Marcus had more to tell me, and it was worse than anything I'd imagined. Your daughter-in-law isn't just greedy, Mrs. Castellano. She's done this before. The room seemed to spin around me. What do you mean, done this before? Marcus pulled out a thick file folder and spread the contents across his desk. Police reports, newspaper clippings, insurance claim documents, death certificates. A paper trail of destruction that went back 5 years. Cassie Patterson, that's her maiden name, was married before she met your son. Her first husband was a man named Robert Patterson, 68 years old, owned a successful plumbing business in Phoenix. They were married for 2 years before Robert died suddenly of what appeared to be a heart attack. He showed me the death certificate, the insurance payout, $150,000, and the newspaper obituary that described Robert as a loving husband who'd been looking forward to retirement. She collected the insurance money, sold the business, and moved to Denver. That's where she met your son. But Robert Patterson wasn't the end of the story. There was also Harold Morrison, a widower in his 70s who'd been dating Cassie for 6 months before she married David. Harold had died in his sleep of apparent natural causes, leaving behind a life insurance policy that named Cassie as the beneficiary. She'd convinced him to change his will just 2 weeks before his death. And there was Margaret Chen, no relation to Marcus, an elderly woman Cassie had befriended while working at a nursing home in Phoenix. Margaret had died of food poisoning after eating soup that Cassie had brought her from her favorite restaurant. Margaret's will, which she changed just days before her death, left everything to my dear friend Cassie, who's been like a daughter to me. 3 people. 3 suspicious deaths. 3 insurance payouts or inheritance windfalls. And now Cassie was working on victim number 4. Me. Why didn't anyone connect the dots? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Different cities, different names. She uses variations of Patterson, Morrison, Chen. Different methods, different relationships. And she's smart about it. She never gets too greedy too fast. She builds genuine relationships with these people, becomes part of their lives, earns their trust. By the time she kills them, everyone believes she loved them. I thought about the expensive gifts she'd been bringing me, the concerned phone calls, the sudden interest in spending time together. The pattern was exactly the same. But there was one more thing Marcus needed to tell me, and it was the most chilling revelation of all. Mrs. Castellano, Your son isn't just helping her with your murder. He helped her with the others, too. The evidence was all there. David had been in Phoenix when Robert Patterson died. He'd been in Denver when Harold Morrison died. He'd been working at the same nursing home where Margaret Chen died, had in fact been the one to recommend Cassie for the job. David wasn't an accomplice who'd been corrupted by love or greed. He was a partner in a serial killing operation that had been going on for years. My son was a murderer. Multiple times over. And I was supposed to be his next victim. Mr. Chen, I said, looking at the evidence spread across his desk, how would you like to help me make sure that doesn't happen? He smiled for the first time since I'd walked into his office. Mrs. Castellano, I thought you'd never ask. We spent the next 2 hours planning something that would either save my life or get us both killed trying. But at 73, after learning that my own son wanted me dead, I figured I didn't have much left to lose. And David and Cassie were about to learn that Dorothy Castellano didn't go down without a fight. A big fight. Marcus Chen and I made an unlikely team, a 73-year-old retired real estate mogul and a middle-aged private investigator with questionable ethics. But we had 2 things in common that made us perfect partners. We both wanted David and Cassie destroyed, and we were both old enough not to care about the consequences of doing whatever it took to make that happen. The plan we came up with was ambitious, dangerous, and probably illegal in at least 6 different ways. But it was also poetic justice in its purest form. Here's what we know, Marcus said, spreading out a timeline on his desk. Cassie thinks you don't suspect anything. David thinks the oleander poisoning failed because Lorraine accidentally got the dose meant for you. They're both panicking, but they're also committed to finishing what they started because $18 million is too much money to walk away from. He pulled out his phone and showed me a text message he'd received that morning from Cassie. She wanted to meet with him urgently, needed to discuss accelerating the timeline and implementing contingency measures. In other words, they were moving to Plan B. What's Plan B? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. Based on our previous conversations, it's a staged home invasion. They'll make it look like you surprised a burglar, that you were killed during a robbery gone wrong. Quick, violent, and harder to investigate for poison residue. My blood went cold. When? Soon. Probably within the next few days. They can't risk waiting too long, in case Lorraine recovers enough to remember what happened at dinner. That gave us maybe 48 hours to implement our counterplan. 48 hours to turn the hunters into the hunted and make sure that David and Cassie got exactly what they deserved. Here's what we're going to do, Marcus said, pulling out a fresh legal pad. We're going to give them exactly what they want, access to your money, but we're going to make sure they destroy themselves in the process. The first phase of our plan involved me playing the role of the grieving, trusting mother-in-law who was starting to suspect that Lorraine's collapse might not have been an accident. I would call David, express my concerns about the soup, ask him to meet me at my house to discuss family business that I didn't want to talk about over the phone. The conversation would be recorded, of course. Marcus had provided me with a digital recording device that looked like a normal pen but captured high-quality audio from up to 15 feet away. If David confessed to anything, and Marcus was confident that guilty people always confessed when they thought they were in control, we'd have evidence that would hold up in court. But the real genius of our plan was what happened next. During our family meeting, I would tell David that I'd decided to change my will. That I was worried about Lorraine's accident, concerned about family safety, and wanted to make sure my money was protected in case something happened to me. I would ask him to help me transfer the majority of my assets into a family trust that he and Cassie would manage jointly. To David and Cassie, this would look like Christmas morning. Not only would they have legal access to my money without having to kill me, but they'd have control over it immediately instead of waiting for probate after my death. They'd think their plan had worked even better than they'd hoped. But here's what they wouldn't know. The family trust would be a trap. Marcus had connections with a white-collar crime specialist named Jennifer Walsh. Yes, the same last name I'd used as my alias, which Marcus thought was hilarious, who specialized in setting up sting operations for financial fraud cases. Jennifer would create a legitimate-looking trust fund that would actually be monitored by federal investigators. The moment David and Cassie tried to access my money, they'd trigger a comprehensive investigation into their financial activities. The investigation would uncover the previous murders, the insurance frauds, the pattern of elder abuse that had been going on for years. They'd be arrested for multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. They'd spend the rest of their lives in prison. And every penny they'd stolen from their previous victims would be recovered and returned to those families. But we weren't stopping there. The most important thing, Marcus explained, is making sure they can't hurt you during the transition period. They're going to be suspicious about your sudden change of heart, and they might decide that killing you immediately is safer than waiting to see how the trust situation plays out. So phase 2 of our plan involved making me disappear. Not actually disappear, that would defeat the purpose, but disappear in a way that would make it impossible for David and Cassie to find me until the trap was fully set. Marcus had a safe house, a small cabin about 2 hours outside the city that he used for witness protection cases. I would stay there for a few days while Jennifer set up the trust and Marcus gathered additional evidence on David and Cassie's previous crimes. More importantly, I'd be safe there if they decided to implement Plan B ahead of schedule. The third phase was the most satisfying part of our plan, the takedown. Once the trust was established and David and Cassie had taken the bait, we'd arrange a family meeting at a location of our choosing. Somewhere public, somewhere safe, somewhere with plenty of witnesses. I'd tell them I wanted to celebrate our new family financial arrangement, maybe suggest a nice dinner at an upscale restaurant. David and Cassie would come expecting to discuss the details of accessing my money. Instead, they'd find themselves face to face with federal agents, local police, and a district attorney who'd been briefed on their entire criminal history. They'd be arrested on the spot, in front of witnesses, in a way that would make it impossible for them to claim innocence or accuse me of setting them up. The evidence against them would be overwhelming. The recordings of our conversations, the documentation of their previous crimes, the forensic evidence from Thanksgiving dinner, and most damning of all, their attempts to access money through a fraudulent trust fund. It's not going to be easy, Marcus warned me. This kind of operation requires perfect timing, perfect execution, and a lot of luck. If any part of it goes wrong, if they suspect what we're doing, they could escalate to violence immediately. Mr. Chen, I said, looking at the photos of Robert Patterson, Harold Morrison, and Margaret Chen scattered across his desk, they've already escalated to violence. They tried to kill me 3 days ago, and they've killed at least 3 other people that we know about. I'm not going to spend whatever time I have left hiding from my own son and waiting for him to murder me. And if something goes wrong? If they figure out what we're doing and come after you? I smiled, probably the first genuine smile I'd had since Thanksgiving dinner. Then they're going to discover that 73 years of surviving in a man's world has taught me a few things about fighting back. We shook hands on our partnership, and I left Marcus's office feeling something I hadn't felt in days, hope. Not just hope that I'd survive David and Cass's murder plot, but hope that I'd live to see them pay for every life they'd taken, every family they'd destroyed, every trust they'd betrayed. But first, I had to go home and call my son. I had to invite him over for a conversation about family business, knowing that he was planning to kill me, knowing that he saw me as nothing more than an obstacle between him and my money. I had to sit across from the child I'd raised and loved unconditionally for 45 years, and I had to trick him into confessing to murder. If you've ever wondered how far a mother's love can be pushed before it turns into something else entirely, you're about to find out. Because Dorothy Castellano was done being anyone's victim. David arrived at my house at 7 o'clock that evening, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the same concerned expression he'd perfected over the past few months. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought he was genuinely worried about his old mother, genuinely interested in making sure I was okay after the traumatic Thanksgiving we'd all endured. But I did know better now. And watching him hug me at my front door, feeling him pat my back with what I used to think was affection, made my skin crawl in ways I'd never experienced before. "Mom, you sounded upset on the phone," he said, following me into the living room. "Are you okay? I know yesterday was traumatic for all of us." The recording pen was in my shirt pocket, activated, capturing every word. Marcus had tested it that afternoon to make sure the audio quality would be clear enough for legal purposes. Now all I had to do was get my son to confess to attempted murder without getting myself killed in the process. "I'm not okay, David," I said, settling into Vincent's old recliner. "I keep thinking about what happened to Lorraine, and I can't shake the feeling that something about yesterday wasn't right." David sat down on the couch across from me, his body language perfectly relaxed, his expression perfectly concerned. If I didn't know what I knew, his performance would have been completely convincing. "What do you mean, Mom?" "It was terrible. But these things happen. Elderly people have health crises, sometimes at the worst possible times. It's tragic, but it's not unusual." "That's just it, David. Lorraine isn't elderly. She's only 52. And she was perfectly healthy when she arrived yesterday afternoon. Sometimes people hide their health problems, Mom. Maybe she was having issues she didn't want to worry Cassie about. Maybe she was taking medication that interacted with something at dinner. These things are more common than you'd think. He was smooth, I'll give him that. Every response was reasonable, every explanation plausible. If I didn't have evidence of his guilt, I might have been convinced by his logic. But I pressed forward. The thing is, David, I keep thinking about that soup. The timing of when Lorraine collapsed, how quickly it happened, how much it looked like poisoning rather than a heart attack or stroke. For just a moment, David's mask slipped. His eyes flickered with something that might have been fear, might have been calculation. But he recovered quickly. Mom, are you suggesting that someone poisoned Lorraine intentionally? That's a pretty serious accusation. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm just saying that I've been thinking about it, and some things don't add up. Like how Cassie seemed to know exactly what to do when Lorraine collapsed. Like how she was so quick to suggest that Lorraine might have been suicidal. Like how she threw away all the leftovers before anyone could think to test them. David was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. I could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to figure out how much I actually knew versus how much I was guessing. Finally, he leaned forward and took my hands in his. The gesture that used to comfort me now made me want to pull away and run. Mom, I understand that you're upset. Yesterday was traumatic for everyone. But I think you're letting your imagination run away with you. Cassie is grieving her mother's condition. She's not some master criminal who poisoned her own family. What if she wasn't trying to poison her own family, David? The question hung in the air between us, and I watched my son's face as he processed the implications. He was smart enough to understand what I was suggesting, but I needed to hear him say it out loud. I don't understand what you're getting at, Mom. What if Lorraine wasn't the intended victim? What if someone was trying to poison someone else, and Lorraine got the dose by accident? David's hands tightened around mine, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. Who else would anyone want to poison? The person with $18 million who just changed her will and might be planning to change it again. There it was. The accusation, laid out clearly, impossible to misinterpret. I watched David's face as he realized that I knew. Not suspected, not wondered about, but knew. His expression went through the same rapid changes I'd seen on Cass's face at Thanksgiving dinner. Confusion, understanding, panic, and then, this was new. A kind of cold calculation that I'd never seen in my son's eyes before. Mom, he said slowly, that's a very dangerous thing to suggest. Is it? Or is it just the truth? David released my hands and sat back on the couch. When he looked at me again, the concerned son act was completely gone. In its place was someone I didn't recognize, someone who looked at me with the same detached assessment I'd seen Cassie use. How much do you actually know? He asked. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was the moment Marcus had prepared me for, the moment when guilty people usually confessed because they thought they were in control of the situation. I know about the oleander in the garbage disposal. I know about the Google searches on Cass's computer. I know about the timeline you two created, with my death marked as T-Day and the will reading scheduled for the week after Thanksgiving. David was very still, very quiet. Finally, he smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile I remembered from his childhood. It was cold, calculating, predatory. You've been busy, Mom. Breaking into our house, going through our private things. That's not like you. Neither is trying to murder your own mother, but here we are. Here we are, he agreed. So what happens now? Are you going to call the police? Turn in your own son? Destroy your own family? My family was destroyed the moment you decided my life was worth less than my money, David. He nodded slowly, like he was accepting a business decision he didn't entirely like but could live with. You're right, of course. About all of it. The oleander, the planning, the timeline. Cassie found the perfect poison, something that would look like a heart attack in an elderly woman. We researched your routine, your health, your daily habits. We planned everything down to the minute. I felt like I was going to vomit, but I forced myself to keep listening, to keep recording. The only thing we didn't plan for was you switching the soup bowls. That was unfortunate. For Lorraine, And for us. How long have you been planning this, David? About a year. Ever since you mentioned thinking about selling the agency. $18 million, Mom. Do you have any idea what that kind of money means to people like us? People who work regular jobs, who worry about mortgage payments and college funds and retirement savings. You could have just asked me for money if you needed it. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. Asked for how much? A few thousand? Maybe 10 or 20,000 if we had a really good story. That's not life-changing money, Mom. That's not fuck you money. That's not enough to never have to worry about anything ever again. So you decided to kill me for it. We decided to take what should have been ours anyway. You're 73 years old. How much time do you really have left? 5 years? 10 if you're lucky. You were going to die eventually, and when you did, Jessica and I would split everything 50-50. We just moved up the timeline a little bit. The casual way he talked about my death, like it was a business transaction he was explaining to a client, made me understand that my son was gone. Had been gone for a long time, maybe forever. The person sitting across from me was a stranger wearing David's face, using David's voice, but he wasn't my child anymore. He wasn't anyone's child anymore. What about the others, David? Robert Patterson, Harold Morrison, Margaret Chen? Were those just practice runs? David's eyebrows rose slightly. You have been busy. How did you find out about them? Does it matter? I suppose not. Yes, there were others. Cassie has a talent for this kind of work, and I have a talent for planning. We make a good team. You make a good team of murderers. We make a good team of survivors. Do you know what it's like to work your ass off your entire life and still worry about money constantly? Do you know what it's like to watch people like you, people who got lucky with real estate timing and market conditions, live like royalty while the rest of us scrape by? I worked for everything I have, David. Your father and I. Your father is dead, Mom. And you're about to join him. The threat was delivered so casually, so matter-of-factly, that it took me a moment to process what he'd said. When I did, I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the November weather. What do you mean? David pulled out his phone and sent a quick text message. I mean that this conversation has gone on long enough. I mean that you knowing about our plans creates a problem that needs to be solved immediately. My blood went ice cold. David, you're scaring me. Good. You should be scared. Because Plan B is about to become Plan A, and unlike the oleander poisoning, there's no antidote for what's coming next. I heard a car door slam in my driveway, footsteps on my front porch, a key turning in my front door lock. Cass's voice calling out sweetly, Dorothy? David? We're here. We? David smiled that cold, predatory smile again. I texted Cassie when you started asking questions about the other victims. She's bringing some friends who specialize in making problems disappear. I heard multiple sets of footsteps in my hallway, moving toward the living room. I heard Cass's voice giving quiet instructions to people I couldn't see yet. David leaned forward and patted my hand one last time. Don't worry, Mom. It'll be quick. We've learned from experience that the key to a good staged home invasion is making sure the victim doesn't suffer unnecessarily. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear at least 3 different voices, including Cass's, discussing logistics in the kind of professional tones that suggested this wasn't their first time doing this kind of work. And I realized that Marcus and I had made a terrible mistake in our planning. We'd assumed that David and Cassie were amateurs, that they'd panic and make mistakes when confronted with evidence of their crimes. But they weren't amateurs. They were professionals who'd been doing this for years, who'd killed multiple people, who had a network of accomplices and a system for cleaning up loose ends. And I was about to become their next loose end. But Dorothy Castellano hadn't survived 73 years by giving up when things got dangerous. And if David and Cassie thought they were going to murder me in my own living room, they were about to learn that their old mother had a few tricks they hadn't planned for. The recording pen in my pocket had captured everything. David's confession, his threats, his casual admission to multiple murders. If I died tonight, at least there would be evidence of what he'd done. But I wasn't planning to die tonight. I was planning to fight. The next 60 seconds unfolded in slow motion, the way they say happens when you're about to die. I could hear Cassie and her friends moving through my house like they owned it, discussing the best way to stage my murder like they were planning a dinner party. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that a 73-year-old woman would be helpless in the face of their violence. They'd forgotten that I'd survived an abusive first husband, had built a business in a man's world, had raised 2 children as a single mother after Vincent died. Most importantly, they'd forgotten that Vincent had been a Marine, and that he'd taught me a few things about defending myself before his heart attack took him away from me. The .38 special was in the drawer of the end table next to my chair, loaded and ready, exactly where it had been for the past 8 years. Vincent had insisted I learn to shoot after the 3rd break-in in our neighborhood, and I'd practiced at the gun range every month for 20 years. David knew about the gun, of course. But he'd probably forgotten about it, the way children forget that their parents had lives and skills and experiences before they were born. He was about to be reminded. As Cass's voice got closer to the living room, I slowly reached for the drawer handle. David was watching me, but he was relaxed, confident that I was trapped and helpless. He probably thought I was reaching for tissues or pills or some other old lady accessory. The moment my fingers closed around the grip of the .38, everything changed. I pulled the gun out and pointed it directly at David's chest in one smooth motion, the way Vincent had taught me 25 years ago. Smooth, steady, no hesitation. The safety was already off. Vincent's rule was that an unloaded gun was just an expensive paperweight, and a gun with the safety on was almost as useless. David's eyes went wide with shock. "Mom, what are you?" "Shut up," I said, and I meant it. "Put your hands on your head and don't move." The authority in my voice surprised even me. But pointing a gun at someone, even someone who'd been planning to kill you, has a way of clarifying your priorities very quickly. Cass's voice was right outside the living room now. "David, is everything going smoothly in there?" "Tell her everything's fine," I whispered to David. "Tell her you need a few more minutes to finish our conversation. And David, if you try to warn her, if you say anything other than exactly what I told you to say, I will put a bullet in your chest and explain to the police that you broke into my house with accomplices and I defended myself." David stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Which, in a way, he was. He'd been thinking of me as a helpless old woman for so long that he'd forgotten I was a survivor who'd been fighting for everything I had since before he was born. "Everything's fine, Cassie," he called out, his voice only slightly strained. "Just give me a few more minutes to finish talking to Mom about the family business." "Are you sure? You sound a little tense." I pressed the barrel of the gun against David's forehead, just hard enough for him to feel the cold metal. He got the message. "I'm fine," he called out, more steadily this time. "Just some emotional family stuff, you know? Why don't you and the guys wait in the kitchen? This might take a little while." "Okay, but remember what we discussed about the timeline. We can't afford to wait too long." I heard footsteps moving toward the back of the house, voices fading as they moved away from the living room. We had maybe 10 minutes before they got suspicious about how long our conversation was taking. "Here's what's going to happen, David," I said quietly, keeping the gun trained on his chest. "You're going to call Marcus Chen right now and tell him to implement the backup plan we discussed. You're going to tell Cassie and her friends that the family meeting is postponed, that you need to take me to the hospital because I'm having chest pains. And then you're going to walk out of this house and never come back." David stared at me with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Marcus Chen? How do you know about Marcus Chen?" "I know a lot of things you didn't count on me knowing. I know about the trust fund trap we set up. I know about the federal investigation that's about to come down on you and Cassie like the wrath of God. I know about the recording device in my pocket that's captured every word you've said tonight, including your confession to multiple murders." The color drained from David's face. "You're bluffing." "Am I? Do you really want to bet your life on that?" For a long moment, we stared at each other across the gap that used to be filled with a mother's love and a son's respect. Now there was nothing between us but a loaded gun and the wreckage of a family that had been destroyed by greed and betrayal. "Call Marcus," I repeated. "Now." David pulled out his phone with shaking hands. I listened as he placed the call, as he used the code words Marcus had given me to indicate that our plan had been compromised and we needed immediate assistance. "It's done," Marcus's voice said through the phone speaker. "FBI is 20 minutes out. Local PD is 10 minutes out. Can you hold your position until then?" "Roger that," I said, taking the phone from David. "But you might want to tell them to come in fast and hard. We've got multiple hostiles in the house, and they're armed and dangerous. Understood. Dorothy, are you okay? I'm fine, Marcus, but I'm about to find out how good an actress I am. I hung up the phone and looked at David. Here's what's going to happen next. You're going to go into that kitchen and tell Cassie and her friends that I'm having heart problems, that we need to call this off for tonight and reschedule. You're going to convince them to leave, and you're going to do it in a way that doesn't make them suspicious. And if I refuse? Then I shoot you right here and tell the police that you broke into my house with a gang of criminals and tried to kill me. Which, technically, is exactly what happened. David studied my face, looking for any sign that I was bluffing, any hint that I wouldn't actually pull the trigger on my own son. But whatever he saw in my eyes convinced him that Dorothy Castellano wasn't playing games anymore. What about after tonight? What about the investigation, the charges, the prison time? That depends on how cooperative you are with the authorities. And how much remorse you show for what you've done to me, to Lorraine, to those other people you killed. I can't go to prison, Mom. I'm not built for that kind of life. You should have thought about that before you decided to become a serial killer, David. He was quiet for a moment, and for just a second I saw a flash of the little boy I used to tuck into bed every night. The child who used to have nightmares and crawl into bed with Vincent and me for comfort. But that little boy was gone, had been gone for years. The man sitting across from me was a stranger who'd been planning to murder me for money, and no amount of maternal love could change that fact. Go, I said, gesturing toward the kitchen with the gun. You have about 7 minutes before the police arrive. I suggest you use them wisely. David stood up slowly, his hands still raised, his eyes never leaving the gun in my hands. As he walked toward the kitchen, I heard him take a deep breath, preparing to give the performance of his life. Because if he couldn't convince Cassie and her accomplices to leave peacefully, the next few minutes were going to turn into a shootout in my living room. And while I was prepared to defend myself, I wasn't sure I was prepared for what would happen if I had to kill my own son to stay alive. But I was about to find out, because I could hear raised voices from the kitchen, and they didn't sound happy about the change in plans. David was arguing with someone, voices getting louder, someone saying they couldn't afford to wait, that they'd already committed to the timeline, that loose ends needed to be tied up tonight. And then I heard the sound that made my blood run cold, footsteps coming back down the hallway toward the living room, fast and purposeful. David hadn't been able to convince them to leave. Plan B was back in effect, and I was about to find out whether a 73-year-old woman with a .38 special could take on a gang of professional killers in her own living room. But if that's what it took to survive, if that's what it took to make sure David and Cassie paid for what they'd done, then that's exactly what Dorothy Castellano was prepared to do. The footsteps were almost at the living room now. I could hear Cass's voice, angry and impatient, demanding to know what was taking so long. In about 10 seconds, they were going to come around that corner and find me sitting in Vincent's old recliner with a gun pointed at the doorway, ready to defend my life and my home against the son who'd betrayed me and the daughter-in-law who'd tried to murder me. It wasn't how I'd planned to spend my retirement. But it was exactly the kind of fight that Vincent would have been proud to see me win. And I was going to win, even if it killed me. The showdown in my living room lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I know because I watched the digital clock on my cable box count down what I thought might be the last minutes of my life. Cassie came around the corner first, moving fast and angry, with David right behind her looking like a man who'd already accepted his fate. Behind them were 2 men I'd never seen before. One tall and thin with dead eyes, one shorter and stockier with hands that looked like they'd done violence before. When Cassie saw me sitting in Vincent's chair with the .38 pointed directly at her chest, she stopped so suddenly that the men behind her almost ran into her. Well, she said after a moment, her voice dripping with the kind of cold amusement I'd never heard from her before. This is unexpected. Is it? I asked, keeping the gun steady. You tried to poison me 3 days ago. You've been planning to kill me for almost a year. You murdered at least 3 other people for their money. Did you really think I was going to sit here like a helpless old lady and let you finish the job? The tall man with dead eyes moved slightly to the left, trying to get an angle on me. I shifted the gun toward him without taking my eyes off Cassie. I wouldn't, I said calmly. I've been shooting for 25 years, and at this range, I don't miss. You're not going to shoot anyone, Dorothy, Cassie said confidently. You're a nice old lady who goes to church and volunteers at the animal shelter. You're not a killer. You're right, I agreed. I'm not a killer. But I am a mother who's been betrayed by her own son, and I am a woman who's been targeted for murder by someone I welcomed into my family. And most importantly, I am someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose. The stockier man reached inside his jacket, probably going for a weapon. I swung the gun toward him and pulled the trigger. The .38 is loud in an enclosed space. Loud enough that everyone jumped, loud enough that my ears rang, loud enough that the neighbors 3 houses down probably heard it. The bullet took the stocky man in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. The next one goes center mass, I said, swinging the gun back toward Cassie. Anyone else want to test whether I'm bluffing? In the sudden silence after the gunshot, we could all hear sirens in the distance, getting closer fast. Marcus had been as good as his word. The cavalry was coming, and they were almost here. Cassie's confident mask finally cracked. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely afraid. You called the police. I called a lot of people. The police, the FBI, the district attorney's office, and a few journalists who specialize in stories about serial killers who prey on elderly victims. By tomorrow morning, your faces are going to be on every news channel in the country. The tall man with dead eyes was backing toward the hallway, probably calculating whether he could make it to the door before the police arrived. I kept the gun trained on him until he was out of my line of sight, then focused back on Cassie and David. David, I said, looking at my son, you have about 2 minutes before this house is surrounded by federal agents. You can spend those 2 minutes trying to help Cassie escape, or you can spend them thinking about whether you want to be remembered as a serial killer or as someone who finally did the right thing and helped stop one. David looked between me and Cassie, his face a mask of indecision and terror. For a moment, I thought he might actually choose his mother over his murderous wife. But then Cassie grabbed his arm and started pulling him toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen door and whatever escape route they'd planned. Come on, David. We can still get out of this. We can disappear, start over somewhere else. David hesitated for one more second, looking back at me with something that might have been regret. Then he turned and followed his wife toward the back of the house, choosing her over me one final time. I let them go. The house was already surrounded. I could see police cars pulling up outside, their red and blue lights painting the walls of my living room. Marcus had kept his promise about the backup plan, and David and Cassie weren't going to get 50 feet from my back door before they were in custody. The wounded man on my floor was holding his shoulder and groaning, but he wasn't going anywhere. The tall man with dead eyes had disappeared, probably trying to find his own way out of a house that was rapidly becoming a crime scene. 30 seconds later, my front door exploded inward and my living room filled with FBI agents, local police, and paramedics. I carefully placed the .38 on the end table and raised my hands, identifying myself as the homeowner and victim. The next few hours were a blur of statements, medical examinations, evidence collection, and phone calls. Marcus arrived within minutes of the police, followed by Richard, my lawyer, followed by Jessica, who'd gotten a call from Marcus and driven over in a panic. Jessica's reaction to learning that her brother had tried to kill me was exactly what you'd expect from someone finding out that their family was built on lies and murder. She cried, she screamed, she demanded to know how this could have happened. She blamed herself for not seeing the signs. But mostly, she held me while I gave my statement to the FBI agents, and she promised that no matter what happened with David, I would always have family who loved me. David and Cassie were arrested in my backyard, exactly as I'd predicted. The stocky man, whose name turned out to be Frank Delacroix, a career criminal with a long history of violence, was treated for his gunshot wound and arrested at the hospital. The tall man with dead eyes, Marcus later identified him as Tommy Santos, wanted for questioning in 3 other murder cases, was caught 2 blocks from my house by a police dog named Rex. The evidence against all of them was overwhelming. The recording of David's confession, the forensic evidence from Thanksgiving dinner, the research Marcus had compiled on their previous victims, and the testimony of Lorraine Patterson, who'd woken up in the hospital with clear memories of watching Cassie put something in the soup. But the most damning evidence came from Cassie herself. When she was arrested, she was carrying a notebook with detailed plans for my murder, including backup methods if the oleander poisoning failed. She'd written everything down, probably thinking it would help her keep track of the details, never imagining that her own notes would become evidence in her prosecution. The trial lasted 6 weeks. David pled guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, and fraud, hoping for a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation. He testified against Cassie, providing details about their previous victims and their methods of operation. Cassie, on the other hand, fought the charges all the way. She claimed that David had forced her to participate, that she was a victim of domestic abuse, that everything had been his idea. She even tried to claim that I'd set them up, that the whole thing was an elaborate frame job orchestrated by a vindictive old woman who wanted to destroy her son's happiness. The jury didn't buy it. After deliberating for less than 4 hours, they found Cassie guilty on all counts: 4 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and elder abuse. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. David got 25 years, with the possibility of parole after 15. The judge said that while his cooperation had been noted, the fact that he'd been planning to murder his own mother showed a level of depravity that couldn't be overlooked. Frank Delacroix got 15 years for attempted murder and conspiracy. Tommy Santos, it turned out, was wanted for more than just questioning. He was eventually convicted of 2 other murders and sentenced to death. As for me, I sold my house and moved to a retirement community in Arizona, where the weather is warm and nobody knows my story unless I choose to tell it. I set up college funds for Emma and Michael, took Jessica and Bradley on that cruise I'd promised, and donated half of my remaining money to organizations that help elder abuse victims. I kept the other half because, at 74, I figure I've earned the right to be comfortable in my old age. And because you never know when you might need $18 million to fight off the next person who thinks a little old lady is an easy target. Jessica visits me once a month, and we never talk about David. He writes me letters from prison, long, rambling apologies full of regret and self-pity, but I don't read them. Richard handles all that, responding with legal form letters that acknowledge receipt but offer no forgiveness. Because here's the thing I learned from this whole experience. There are some betrayals that can't be forgiven, some trust that can't be rebuilt, some relationships that can't be repaired. David made his choice when he decided my life was worth less than my money. He made it again when he chose to follow Cassie instead of staying with me when the police arrived. Those choices have consequences, and one of those consequences is that he no longer has a mother. I know that sounds harsh. I know it sounds cold. But at 74 years old, after surviving an attempt on my life by my own child, I don't have time for forgiveness I don't feel or relationships that were built on lies. I have time for the people who love me without conditions, who value my life more than my money, who would never dream of hurting me for their own benefit. I have time for Jessica and her family, for new friends who knew nothing of my past, for quiet mornings and peaceful evenings and the simple pleasure of being alive when other people wanted me dead. And sometimes, late at night when the Arizona desert is quiet and the stars are bright, I think about Vincent and how proud he would be that his Dorothy fought back when it mattered most. If you've made it this far in my story, if you've listened to every horrible detail of how my own family betrayed me and tried to take everything I'd worked for, then I want you to remember something important. You are stronger than you think you are. You are more capable than people give you credit for. And if someone tries to take advantage of your trust, your love, or your generosity, you have every right to fight back with everything you've got. Don't let anyone tell you that family loyalty means accepting abuse. Don't let anyone convince you that forgiveness is more important than justice. And don't ever let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting yourself from people who want to hurt you. I'm 74 years old, and I survived my own son's attempt to murder me. If I can do that, you can handle whatever challenges you're facing in your own life. Trust me on that one. I've been testing my limits for 7 decades, and I'm not done yet. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for staying with me through the dark parts and the difficult truths. And if this story helped you understand something about your own life, your own family, or your own strength, then sharing it was worth every painful memory I had to relive. Hit that like button if this story moved you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who refuse to be victims. And comment below to let me know where you're watching from. Because stories like this connect us all, no matter where we live or what we've been through. Take care of yourselves out there. And remember, you're stronger than you know.